Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com. Smart leaders know that they would greatly increase productivity and innovation if they could get everyone fully engaged. So do professors, facilitators, and every single change maker. The challenge is how. Liberating Structures are novel, practical, and no-nonsense methods to help you accomplish this goal with groups of any size. Prepare to be surprised by how simple and easy they are for anyone to use. Today's book shows us how, with detailed descriptions for putting them into practice, plus tips on how to get started and traps to avoid. It takes the design and facilitation methods experts use and puts them within the reach of anyone in any organization or initiative, from the front line to the C-suite. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, Simple Rules to Unleash a Culture of Innovation, Keith McCandless. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Aidan.
This is a take two. I have to tell our audience this. We tried to record last week. We had a total tech malfunction, actually a Wi-Fi malfunction. And luckily, Keith has moved to a different place to actually record today with much better Wi-Fi. But Keith, I wanted to actually say something you said to me in prep for today, because it actually spoke to me, where sometimes you're in a very messy environment. And one of the great guests I had on the show before was David Deutsch, and there's an actual BBC interview with him, and the BBC interviewer is commenting on how messy his surroundings is, and he turns to the guy and he's like, I know where everything is. And sometimes you see that with great minds, you see that with people who like to work in that type of environment, and you said that to me, that you like to work in that type of environment for a very purposeful reason. I'd love you to share that before we even get stuck into the book.
I think the best example of it, the first time we field tested this work, the Liberating Structures, was in hospital settings where superbugs were spreading. And in a hospital, lots of different people come in and out of rooms all the time. And there's some science about how to stop the spread, but each person to stop the spread, everybody has to change their behavior kind of at the same time in different ways. And so that's just built-in complexity, built-in messiness. There's 15 languages being spoken. There's every kind of technical gizmo around people, and there's a power dynamic. The physicians and the managers, and it goes all the way down to people cleaning the room. And every one of those people need to contribute something unique to stop the spread of superbugs.
And let's talk about that later on as well. But for those people wondering, should they invest their time with us today, let's share what the big idea is and maybe a definition of what a liberating structure is.
A definition is simpler than a method. So as soon as you say the word method, it's like, oh, only an expert can do that. And in your intro, you said, oh, this is for everybody. Well, these are really patterns. So if you think about the pattern of, you go into a room and there's a presentation. Do you have to think about a method to do that? You don't. You just know what's going to happen. Everybody has a role, the steps and the results. You can expect it. Well, liberating structures are like that. It's a set of patterns. There's now 43 simple patterns that anyone can use. You don't have to be a methodological genius to do it. And what they do is make it possible to include every voice in shaping what happens next. And not only what happens next, but the future. And that there's a number of practical reasons to do that, which we'll get into. But these are patterns that you can easily start to use to include all of the voices, all of the expertise, all of the experience that adds up to something where you can be more creative and adaptive as an organization.
Keith, one of the things I thought we'd talk about was the idea of complexity, because it really is a foundational idea behind your work. And the messiness, even the complexity talks to that messiness, because it's from the messiness that you actually can create brilliance. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about that, because you also share admiration for a great friend of the show and a gentleman I became friends with through the show, which was the great D Hawk, the founder of Visa and the author of this idea of the chaotic organization, which we both love. Maybe we'll say something about complexity and then also about D Hawk, may he rest in peace.
Yeah. Well, when you look through a complexity lens at the world, you can see that the world is mostly mechanistically viewed, and the habits that we've developed over centuries are more cause and effect oriented. And you do this, you do that, and you're going to get this result. And most of the complexity scientists understand that their causes and effects can be causes and effects of themselves. It's more circular, it's messier. And when you're facing a complex challenge, there's lots of different levels of input that contribute to any significant transformation. So the ecological view is a better lens through which to look at this work. And it's in stark contrast to a mechanistic one. And so in mechanistic things, you change the part. You focus on the attention on the part. You're going to fix that part of the machine, and then the whole machine will work. In a complex system, you look at the relationship among the parts. What's the pattern of relationship among the parts? In this case, the parts are people. So I don't want to fix a person. I have no need to fix you. You are perfect as you are, but the way you're relating, the pattern of how you're relating to others in your work environment or your family or even to yourself, that pattern of relating, if you take a small enough view, and we take a microstructural view of it, if you can shift that pattern, that shifts the entire system, not just a part. So the beauty of it, and the simplicity of it is, you can ignore fixing the parts, but you focus all your attention on the pattern of relationship among the parts.
We'll dive into that, because the big thing I took from the book was I loved them. We hosted on the show before BJ Fogg, who wrote the book Tiny Habits, who spawned books like Atomic Habits. James Clear, I think, even took one of BJ Fogg's classes. And the idea of habits, I mean, if you think about any type of change, a personality change, that it's actually starts with small little habit changes first. They compound and they join together and they become a shift in personal reality, which becomes personality. And I loved what you wrote here. You said it is possible to influence culture instead of change culture. Through the use of liberating structures, the word change itself implies from going from A to B, which suggests that B is already been decided. And there's a diagram in the book, and I'm going to show this on the screen for those people watching us on YouTube. But for those who aren't, let's have a little bit of empathy for them, because this diagram shows how liberating structures influence change rather than change itself. So I'm going to share this on the screen now, and let's just describe it a little bit for those people who can't see it, Keith.
A lot of attention is paid in most organizations on values, what we say, the way it should be. And pretty clearly you can see that what we say, there's a difference between what we say and what we do, and there's tension associated with that. The other thing that gets a lot of attention are the beliefs, the vision of what should be. And those are great places to focus, but for me, what liberating structures do, and the most powerful by far, is to look at those habits, what we do every day, and immediately shift the pattern. And with that, we can get closer to doing what we say is important. With our values, we can reduce the difference between what we say is important and what we actually do. And there's various liberating structures to help specifically with that. And these beliefs that we have, because we're getting closer to doing what we say is important, beliefs change about what is possible. And for me, the most powerful, simple place to immediately get started is with, and that's the pattern of everyday interaction. So when you go into a room, who participates, who speaks, and who listens? How much time do they have? And you can play around with those things very quickly and make a dramatic influence on this larger thing is the culture. The interaction of these three elements creates a culture, and the primary place to focus with liberating structures is on these everyday habits.
I loved what you said here. You said at the core of the book is the practical idea that simple shifts in our routine behaviors, our patterns, our interaction make it possible for everyone to be included, engaged, and unleashed in solving problems, driving innovation, and achieving extraordinary outcomes. But you go on to say liberating structures help us let go of control safety. And I thought that was really important because you talked about command and control a lot in the book, as did the great D Hawk. He talked about that. That's actually how we've been trained. It's in our language. And you quote Ludwig Wittgenstein in the opening of the book. But there's another quote by Wittgenstein that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And Dee talked about the fact that most of the language we use in businesses has been imported from war. It's battle language, and it gets into their heads. But so too do top-down structures. And what I loved about liberating structures, and I'd love you to share, is that it's not just quite bottom up. It's everywhere down. It's everywhere dispersed, because it's changes in the habits, not just of the bottom up. It's top down. It's everywhere. It's little nudges that can change and compound. And then you see this ripple effect, like you said, about complexity that leads to a total different reality. So maybe we'll share a little bit about that.
You're making me think about one of the fundamental strategies underneath the work, and it's called the adjacent possible. And so this comes out of biology, but it's another complex system, and it makes sense that innovation unfolds not through a big idea, or rarely is it a big idea that comes and changes everything. It's the exploitation or the adaptation of your nearest neighbor, the thing closest to you. And what we're doing with liberating structures is inviting each person to explore the immediate neighborhood, make small adaptations to it, and report back on what they're learning in a continuous fashion. And so it's at its core, and I think this is why I'm talking with you, at its core, it's an innovation strategy that starts with every person's ability to creatively adapt and explore that neighborhood in which they're in. It doesn't come from an expert, doesn't come down. It really comes from what they already know and who they already are. And through, again, changing this pattern of how they're relating to many different levels of people in the organization, different ideas about what's happening when you're faced with a big disruption. Each individual is really developing a unique next step. And the combination of those neighborly next steps is the source of innovation that this work unleashes.
When you read a book like this, you think about yourself, and you think about places where maybe you've seen this manifest. And one of the places that manifested was, I remember, luckily it was right before COVID, I had a chat with my wife, and I was like, let's, this might have been a bit loaded here, but what I wanted to do was kind of list stuff that we were doing, each of us were doing, that was getting on the other person's nerves. So one of the things that came up was, my wife said, I had a habit of leaving the cupboards open in the kitchen. And so I changed it. So I actually made a conscious effort to do it. It was a tiny thing. Like for me, it was kind of flippant. I'm from the country, so it wasn't a huge deal. But for her, it was a huge deal because cleanliness and hygiene and flies and all that kind of stuff, right? So I did it, and it had a dramatic impact on our relationship, or positive impact. It reminded me of that because it was like this little tiny habit that would become a bad habit that was just compounding over and over again, and it was probably making what other things that were small seem bigger because I was constantly doing this. But then you point out in the book, because I want to actually talk about this, how this can help your life at a personal level. It's not just about business, because you talked about a father who had been for almost a year unable to get beyond a monosyllabic response from his teenage daughter. So let's share how one little change there, and this is an example of a liberating structure, changed where all of a sudden she's talking to him for over an hour.
Henry and I, when we're doing field work to support this, the very first times we go into a country, work with a big company, do strategy work to like, can we move the next level? Can we make this transition that the whole company's trying to make across the world here in Brazil? And we'd stay for a week afterward and do office hours, and people would come in, and we thought they were going to want to talk about the business. They had an hour to use any way they wanted, and inevitably it would be, well, I want to use this particular liberating structure. Let's one that we call creative destruction is family one. They want to talk about their kids and their family. The business issues were down the list, 7 or 8 or 9, all of the things they really wanted to talk about. So what we recommended, and what people often did, was with a child in your home, one thing that's pretty effective is to ask, what are all the things that you can do to really rub the entire family wrong and irritate, or do, what's the worst behavior you can imagine that's going to disrupt the family? And let's all think about that together. What are all the things we can do? And they tend it to be a list of habits. Let's imagine all of the ones that we could do. And then the second part is, well, which ones are we actually doing, that are going on in this household? And then third part of it, sounds complicated, but it isn't. Third part is, well, which ones can we stop? Which ones, when, where, when? Like maybe Aidan, you'd say, well, I can close the cupboard. I can try to do that. But here, the big idea behind that, even at the family level or the individual level, if for innovation to emerge, there needs to be things that are stopped. There has to be open space for a new behavior to enter in to this environment in which you're operating. And so it's one of the fundamental liberating structures. We used to call it TRIZ, but it's poorly named. It's creative destruction. It's like, what is it that we can stop to make space for innovation? And for me, it was a surprise. It works in the family. It works in a corporation, and it probably works everywhere. But I had to be shown how it worked at the family level.
I love it. And it reminded me of a Peter Drucker quote that if you want to do something new, you have to stop doing something old. And, when I work with organizations like you do on innovation, I usually start with like habits. And it's actually, where can you carve out new space to innovate or to be innovative in any way? And one of the things I was getting at one of the things I liked about liberating structures is your idea of, and it's not just diversity washing or equity washing. It's like, it's the neurodiversity and equity of contribution, where everybody has the right cognitive capacity to share how they see the world. And if everybody's doing that, you have just such a bigger range of options from that. And I think that's such an important thing. Before we start to go into the concepts of macro structures and microstructures and how most of us are limited with what we actually use, let's share the importance of that quotient that we can lean into as organizations and as leaders.
There's 2 parts of it, I guess. One is we've designed the structures and the way they're described, the patterns, so that somebody who doesn't like to make eye contact can use them productively. Second thing is they all start with some moment to pause to give each individual, because we're inviting them to contribute. We're giving them a minute or more just to think for themselves and write it down. As you're thinking about it, write it down. So we're building in, and there's a lot more to it, but we're building in all the different ways that people learn and like to communicate. And that accommodates the neurodiversity and celebrates it even in lots of ways. There's quite a bit of nonverbal activity, including drawing, expressions, things that we invite that you wouldn't normally see. And so in those two ways, one is the work is simple enough that really anybody can run a structure. And then the nature of the work itself draws out each individual's creative adaptability with whatever strength they have. And yeah, I give examples about that, but you just have, for the moment, take my word for it, that when you look across a repertoire of 43 patterns, every kind of unique contribution or nearly every type of unique contribution is invited by the work.
So one of the ways you describe this is we're limited by language. So this is why I brought up Wittgenstein. We're limited by the letters we use in an alphabet. And you say, actually, most of us are using 5. If even, we're using 5 different letters, and you have a very limited vocabulary if you do that. But you introduced 43, and you've upgraded it even since the first book, Liberating Structures. Now you have the field book as well, which introduces even more. So there's 43 letters, and if you think about the idea of the factorial and how they can all combine like Lego blocks, you can create multiple different things. But let's talk about the difference of that and what those 5 are that limit us mostly. And actually, the big thing you do when you read the book is you realize this is not stupidity by leaders. Most are trained in this. This is all they know of. It's more about ignorance, and not stupidity ignorance. It's like not knowing. So you don't know what you don't know. And when you know there's other options there, you can unleash yourself as a leader. And then the next difficulty becomes, actually, will I try this and will I stick with it? Because it's obviously going to be awkward when I start with these things. So a lot in there, Keith, but the idea of the macrostructures, these limiting ideas, and then microstructures and the idea of the 43 versions of liberating structures.
I spent my whole career looking at macro changes, and starting with quality improvement and then benchmarking and idealized design and scenario planning and design thinking and human-centered design, all the DHOC's work, a whole cavalcade. And I had positions where I was the kind of research director, turning people on to these approaches. And the single disappointing, soul-crushing experience with that is they never really caught on. There's some experts that were developed in small clumps within organizations, but they never were practiced in any depth. And they usually were made to mirror the expert orientation, the mechanical orientation, that it's everything around us. So we mimic that in how we adopted these very exciting ideas, these approaches. And so because of the complexity science and thinking, it's the pattern of relationship. It's not the ideas themselves, the pattern underneath about how we're using human-centered design or chaotic design or it doesn't matter. They all fell into the same, I'm going to call it a trap, and I'm going to be really hard on the way the trap manifests in habits. So the habits that get in our way is these ideas are delivered in a presentation, right? And a presentation is very limiting. It's a monopoly on all the good idea. So it's one person's idea, and they're lay it on you, and at the end of a presentation, they may remember to after all these ideas that are spewed out, are there any questions? But they'll probably forget because it's a total ego trip. There's very little relationship between the presenter and the unwashed, right? It's a power dynamic that's negative. So I'm going to be really hard on each of these big five. We call them the big five. The second one is, well, let's bring an expert facilitator in. And let's have the leader work in cahoots with the expert facilitator to get the outcomes, predetermined outcomes, out there. And so the group will arrive at a place that we've already predetermined. Well, everybody knows. They just need to sit back, kind of let it wash over them, but they're going to have to do something later. And when you bring the facilitator in, again, I'm being not very nice about this, but they're working in cahoots and you really don't have any influence over it, and people know it. Okay. So that's the managed discussion is what it's called. And oftentimes the leader will think, oh, well, we'll get some great interaction there and it'll be great. We'll all agree on the thing we already determined. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work, Aidan. It doesn't. Third thing is a status report. Everybody, let's hear everybody's voice. And you're sitting around the table or wherever it is, and only at someone who's demented would actually say anything that wasn't rosy and positive, right? Status report is always, well, what does the leader want to hear? What do you think? Are they having a bad day or good day? Can we add anything that's actually spicy in this update? Usually no. There's no cover. It's very dangerous. Fourth one, which is more modern, but it's the brainstorm. Let's get a couple of the really smart, high talented people in a room away from wherever the operations or action is. And we'll have them dream up some really great best practices or, really big ideas. And then later on, we'll have to bribe or coerce people to adopt those brainstorm ideas. Right? So that's brainstorming. And again, I'm not being nice, but that's often how it rolls frequently. So these are all patterns. I'm describing a dynamic and a pattern. And then the fifth one of the big five, and these are the only ones we seem to use. The fifth one is the open discussion. And this is when the leader or manager or whoever's convening the group hasn't gotten what they need from a presentation or a facilitated discussion, a brainstorm, or a update kind of thing. And they just say, anybody can say anything. The rules are open. And typically what that does, there's not enough structure there. So a couple people get into a familiar argument and everybody is sort of amused, but it's not productive kind of conversation. And then at the end, the manager or leader usually has to say, isn't it great that we all had a chance to say what we think? And now we're going to go with the idea that that we had before. And it's all so that's what we have, Aidan. I'm not being nice about it, but that's kind of where we are. And it's all either over controlled or under controlled.
I'm trying to think of the guy. There's a quote. Oh, it's like, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. And it's kind of like that. It's like, we have the strategy. We have to pretend to the group that we've listened to them, so they feel that they're empowered and that we've taken in their feedback on board. There's a cartoon that I often share where it shows a lady putting an idea into an idea box, and then it's zoomed out, and underneath the table there's a shredder. It just shreds the ideas. I'm like, it's kind of like that. We go through this rigmarole, but it's actually not really listening to people when actually there's gold in there.
Well, even if there's a strategy. So let's say Superbug work again, because this is where it started. I like to talk about it. It was really clear there's things that work to eliminate superbugs, and everybody knew the strategy. They just didn't know. So the strategy is keep surfaces clean, wash your hands, isolate patients, right? So how does housekeeping do that? How does a busy doctor who just wants to pop into the room briefly, how do they do it? How does the person scheduling and the room cleaning and the lunch going in and out of the room, how do all those things, how do you relate to each other on a unit how do you do the strategy together? Even if it's not strategic thinking, it's operational. Everybody's unique, creative, adaptive approach needs to be included. And once it is, then strategy can change too. Okay, so anyway, you triggered me.
Hopefully not in a negative sense.
No, we're like, I've got to tell you.
For those not watching, he's smashing up his environment. He's trying to make it messy again. I triggered him. But I wanted to come back to one of the definitions because it's a term you coined, which is microstructures. And I'll pull a little excerpt from the book here. Tangible microstructures are the physical spaces where interactions or work take place. They are like the room where the family eats dinner. They include how we choose to arrange the tangible structural elements within that space, tables, chairs, flip charts, and the like. Intangible ones are how we micro-organize our interactions with elements such as an agenda. And I pulled this excerpt in particular. Conventional microstructures, in one form or the other, have been around for centuries. They are designed for convincing, teaching, debating, brainstorming, controlling, or some combination of these purposes. Their usefulness, however, is limited by side effects that are difficult or impossible to avoid, such as unengaged participants or audiences, excessive power dynamics, and competition for attention, bodies present but minds absent. And the reason I pulled that, Keith, I would love your opinion on this because you wrote the first book a long time ago. Not that long ago, but particularly it was before we had so much interaction on tools like Slack or WhatsApp or Zoom or Teams or any of these platforms. And as a facilitator, when you're asked to do some type of webinar or some type of event virtually, that, for me, that compounds because the human energy, the setup of the room, they're so important. And I actually do think this, Keith, that oftentimes when you're the facilitator and you ask for the room to be set up in a certain way, there's a little bit of like, oh, that person's being awkward. But it has such a dramatic effect. I mean, it's the point of the whole book. But in a virtual world, that becomes even more difficult. And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So you got to get the new book because we integrate completely online facilitation. And we started with the idea, just as you're saying, it must be much harder. It isn't. You have to be able to do, well, the main thing we recommend, it's you, the facilitator, you're hosting, and you have a tech host. And the tech host manages breakout rooms and chat and a few things that are not as tangible or physical. But I think I want to invite you to some things to have you see it in person. The same kind of things that you do in a room, you do in a breakout room. And there are some differences, but primarily all but one of the original Liberating Structures made it into the online repertoire. And I think they produce very nearly the same miraculous results. And so the way you do it is similar. Like what we're doing, we're playing around with time. First by yourself, a minute. Get out a pen, even though you're online. Get out a piece of paper and get a pen, and let's make it tactile. For this minute, you have a chance to jot down some thoughts about what we might do next or what you think is going on. Then you're going to go in a breakout room with one other person. And then and you're just going to share your idea. And then you may really like that person, but now you're going to be thrown for a couple minutes and then a breakout room with 4, and there's going to be 2 more ideas. And suddenly the world in which you're trying to figure out what's going on is enriched in the same way that if you had people in chairs and a pair rotated into a group of 4. So as long as you have a tech host doing the work, and now you come back to the main room and those groups of 4, you can have 400 people or 800 people, doesn't matter. The groups of 4 if something spectacular happened in their room, an insight or an action, they're invited to type it into chat, and you have a record of that you can immediately scan up and down. All the participants can see the insights or the actions that were generated by 100 groups of 4. So that I'm talking about the upside of online interactions. It is more challenging. I'll tell you that the reality of it is in generating momentum and action. Like, so what we want, and the reason liberating structures have spread around the world, is because they generate engagement, they generate resolve, and they generate action. So if you want the resolve and the action, not just the engagement, but also everybody brings their imagination. They start to decide, I need to do this. I need to make my little move in the neighborhood, my adjacent possible option, and I'm going to do it. So if you can get that, it won't matter to you whether it's online or face-to-face.
You just reminded me, I started my business during COVID, and that's what I was doing. I was doing this stuff. I didn't have the language for it, but I probably am showing a personal preference here of the one thing I feel like it was great. Those sessions went well, but like you emit an energy, and I think people can feel that better when you're in a session. But when you're talking about lots and lots of people, maybe online engages people more. Certainly, some people prefer it. I think where they rather that than actually being in a breakout room rather than being actually a physical room with people. But you triggered one here for us. So you preempted a liberating structure. So just I want to remind our audience again, liberating structures are almost like letters of the alphabet. They can be used to trigger habit change inside an organization, not bottom up, not top down, widespread across the organization. One of them, and it was used actually in my research, apart from reading the book and our rehearsal episode we did, I listened to you interviewed by a former guest on the show, Aaron Dignam, and he has a business called Already, and he talked about the fact that they use one of these liberating structures. They loved your work and they brought it into the organization, and it's the idea of 1, 2, 4, all. And if there's nothing else anyone else does from this episode, it's do this one, because this one, as long as you have, you're either facilitating or you have that many people in your business, you can't do it if you're on your own. 1, 2, 4, all is an easy one to get started with.
I'm going to give context to it. I was in Paris in a corporate headquarters, and we're walking down the hall with my co-author, Henry, and a project manager comes and says, "Come and fix our meeting." It's a nightmare. It's been going on for 2 years. The project managers, there's 20 of us. We're in a room. It's tedious beyond imagination what's going on. And, in France, it's a little different. There's a cultural thing going on. But we go into the room. The lights are turned way down. There's one person in the front droning with a projection on a screen, and everybody else has their computers open part way, and it looks like they're all doing email. And so we've been invited to fix the meeting, and this has been going on for 2 years. It's deadly. First thing, can we turn on the lights? Can we, and what we suggest, let's do a 1, 2, 4 all. What's wrong with this? So the invitation to the whole group is, how do you diagnose what's wrong with this meeting? And first, think for yourself, talk to your partner. They're all in a square configuration, then a group of 4, and come up with the things. So it's 1 minute by themselves, 2 minutes in a pair, group of 4, come up with the key things that are wrong, that are wrong. And so there were 4 groups, I guess, maybe 5 groups, and they all identified the same thing. The 4 minutes, and then all just took 2 or 3 minutes to find out that they all had the same diagnosis. Said, okay, well, let's do another. And this is an interesting thing about 1, 2, 4 all. Repetition is a source of innovation. So we just let's do another one of those, but let's do it about what would be some moves you could make immediately to change the character of this tedious project manager meeting. So they did another one. to for all in that sequence, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and the all. And each group, there was one unique idea, but there were 3 ideas that every group had, and they all agreed, and like they were doing it. That immediately, every voice had been heard. They had 3 really solid solutions to the problem, and they were ready to do it. And in this entire experience in the room with the group, in about a half an hour, Henry and I felt confident that we could leave the room and that they had forever changed that meeting to something productive. And so that's 1, 2, 4 all.
One of the things I thought was so important that it speaks to what we spoke about earlier on was you have a leader in the room. The leader cannot disguise their preference for an idea, and maybe it's their idea. And as to your point earlier on, you said, like, for example, you're kind of looking for cues from the leader. Well, I need to say what they want. I need to be on board. I can't be the person who's like seen as the naysayer, but could be the gainsayer. So don't speak up, because we know what happens the last time people went missing, right? And you're like going, okay, if I do 1, 2, 4 all, I'm spending time on my own first to actually come up with my own genuine ideas, if I have them. And in there, it defeats anchoring. So this anchoring that happens inside organizations to anchor around what idea is deemed the best by everybody else, because these are really important biases that prevent people from innovating all the time.
The CEOs or senior leaders that I've worked with all wanted to change the dynamic. They knew that something was wrong and their groups were dysfunctional in one way or another. And that was a refreshing and mind-blowing for them to let go of that experience that they'd had, that they needed to come up with the idea, and then they needed to push that through. And so I guess emotionally, the habit was harder. They had all the desire and ambition to change it more than other people, but the actual habit of not having their idea make it to the top, I had to have empathy for them often. Not always, because a typical thing that we do would be, I'm going to describe another liberating structure briefly, called the eco cycle. And you put all of your strategies on a chart that has things that are being birthed, things that are mature, strategies that are delivering results, things that need to be creatively destroyed or stopped, and then those that are in gestation, or they're a seed rather than a birth. And on either side, there's a trap, a poverty trap where the seeds don't turn into birth, and a rigidity trap on the other side where the strategy that did work that isn't working anymore doesn't get stopped. You keep using it past its prime. And so when the whole group is involved in placing, individually, they each place where these strategies, the current strategies fit, and the new strategies and strategies that are just seeds at the moment. They put them all up on the ecocycle where they are and start to talk about priorities and all that kind of thing. And then the senior leaders are, oh my, now I see all of these in a context. And I know that it's a really new context for them, and they have really big ideas. And we sort of move that conversation from where things are now to where they might be, and what we might do to move our strategies forward through birth to maturity, what needs to be creatively destroyed, and what needs to be more investment to get a seed to a birth. And that kind of thinking is something that an individual has usually done by themselves, or a senior leader has done by themselves, or just with a few people in the senior team. And suddenly it's all there for everyone to see, a much larger group. And it's breathtaking. And it's breathtaking because, and I'll often ask the leaders privately on the side, well, with a smile, kind of, you knew that, right? You knew that. They didn't see it until the whole group made sense of it, put it up on a map, and started to move it dynamically. And again, the pattern of interaction was there were more voices included, more insight, and the thinking that you normally attach to the senior leadership group was dramatically improved. And I want this, when I'm working with a group, I want that experience, although it's hard, right? That you're not alone. You got the whole group to think strategically. You want to do more of that? And again, I had to learn these lessons in the field. I had one of these big maps on a piece of paper. I like working in face-to-face too. And a big healthcare group, and we spent a couple days on their strategy doing this work I just described. And I didn't go back for another year to work with them, and they unrolled the same piece of paper. And there'd been hundreds of dirty looking Post-it notes and replacements and arrows and comments made on this piece of paper, which was crumpled, and it was just a big mess. But they'd used it every quarter since they'd used it 4 times to rework this magic that was, wow, together as an expanded leadership group was so much smarter than the group, a few people at the top by themselves. So I kind of like, oh, I want you to notice that that was something you didn't know. And that might be a little difficult, but if you want to continue with this work, you need to recognize that the group is going to be more creative and adaptive. The more people we can include in it, the more chance we're going to do really smart things.
I think that's one of those hangovers from the post-World Wars world where many of the leaders who got into positions were rewarded with those positions because they were generals in the army. And you didn't have access to the field, to the battlefield to actually get that information. Or you didn't want it because you didn't have time, or you could be sending people to certain death and you didn't want to know who they were. But that idea of the organization as everybody's empowered as sensors to detect danger, to spot opportunities is a shift that is not really taught in business schools. And I think that this is where we're talking about the ignorance, that it's not stupidity, it's ignorance. It's not knowing that these options are there. And like you said, when the leader themselves has the psychological safety to go, actually, it was Keith in Sector 7G who came up with that idea, and you're talking in the boardroom and you're telling your board that, yeah, we've empowered the whole organization. That's a brilliant story. Like, you don't need to have all the information as the leader. And it brings us to actually chapter 4 of the book, which is called Liberating Leadership. And this is about how leaders can avoid perpetuating the problems they complain about. And you open up this chapter by saying leaders don't purposely set out to demotivate employees or to discourage them from speaking up. They don't want to discourage cooperation. They don't want thousands of useless meetings conducted in their organizations. It's the contrary. They live with these frustrations because they don't see any other choice. So maybe we'll share some ways leaders can actually lean into this, some ideas they can employ. One I just wanted to remind you of is earlier on you talked about the idea of a new leader acquires a company. So this organization acquires another one. They're the company that's being merged. Of course, there's huge fear, huge resistance there. He goes and he has one meeting, conducts that meeting, total bomb site. It was terrible. But he goes a second time, and this time he just sits among everybody else. That's all. The only change. This is a liberating structure in action. Tiny change, dramatically different impact. So with that, I'll tee you up to talk about liberating leadership.
Well, it's a big thing to move from commanding to guiding on the side. And 2 things. One is a little story. A field, let's say, the Veterans Administration hire to run their hospital and hospital system. So this particular guy I'm thinking of, his name was Clyde. He sets up field hospitals and worked in Afghanistan, and a senior military leader, and he moved over to this hospital work in the US. And so he was pretty intrigued, and counterintuitively, in the military, you really do need a lot of intelligence from the field immediately shared back and forth. And so we were doing really early work with Liberating Structures, and there were 90 people in a big room, and they were trying to figure out how to do referral patterns or something. I don't remember the content very well, but we were using a liberating structure called User Experience Fishbowl, where a few people were talking about it, and they could ask people around the outside. These 90 people were in groups, and they were generating ideas too. And partway through, this leader, Henry and I couldn't tell if it was meaningful or what was going on, but this leader just threw up his hands and said, "This is the best conversation, the most action-oriented conversation we've ever had together. All the decisions we just made," and I didn't hear any decisions at all, "are final." He got so excited about this exchange from people closer to the field with the leadership decisions they needed to make as a whole organization, that he was ready in that moment to just like, okay, those are decisions. Now, that's too fast and too soon, and all kinds of things made me uncomfortable about it. But that's the relief that a leader can feel when suddenly they can rely on more people and have some patterns to use to rely on more people to generate direction. Now, the other little story I want to tell you, I can't tell you how many very senior leaders would say to me, "Keith, when I retire, the thing I want to do is what you're doing." And it just made me think, well, why aren't you, wait a second, why, you could be doing it right now. I swish in, I help you, and I go away. Well, you could do that every day here. And there's still some hesitancy. So some clumsiness. Aidan, I think you called it, it's going to be a little clumsy when you first start, right? You'd have to do 1 minute and then 2 minutes, and you need to switch groups. And then, there's all this stuff comes out. How do you make sense out of that? So it does take a little practice, but I think they could ask for help from some people in their organization to get this going. And I've seen plenty of CEOs do the work needed and enable the work needed to make it happen. So it's not insurmountable, but you're going to start somewhere, and it's not going to be, it can be very emotional, but you need to keep it going. It's not just, oh, we're going to use it at the special event, and then we're going to stop using it. It's actually an everyday kind of habit for everyone. So if you get into it, you'll get the best results if you can do it everywhere with everyone.
Amazing. I think it's a lovely place to leave it, actually. And we'll encourage people to get the book, because really we couldn't do it. It'd be like drinking water from the hose pipe to go through all 43 liberating structures today. And the new book is just out. The new field book as well is just out. For you, Keith, where is the best place to find that book, to find you, to find the work that you do with Liberating Structures and your colleague and co-author, Henry?
Yeah, the best place is a website and, well, an app as well. If you're a phone user, at least 33 of the Liberating Structures are available on your phone, and you can just search for it, you'll find it. A new website just created to match the new book is at www.liberatingstructures.com. And books available on Amazon and Lightning Source, and you can find it anywhere in the world. And it's called the Liberating Structures Field Book.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Before I thank you and sign off with you, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology that runs the infrastructure for the world's best businesses. Some of them you mentioned, healthcare, banking. They work with all those kind of organizations with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. Sounds a little bit like Liberating Structures does as well. You can find out more about Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. And finally, I want to thank our author and our guest, author of The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, Keith McCandless. Thank you for joining us.
Aidan, my pleasure. Thank you.